My book is about an extraordinary man named John Addington Symonds, who is not a household name, and he really should be. He was born in 1840 in what was the very start of Victorian Britain. And he was born to an upper middle class family, which had all of the kind of cultural norms of the time of, strong focus on morality, responsibility, conventionality. And this was really part of his struggle, as you'll see. By the time he was really a teenager, he realized that he was what we would today call a gay man, or a gay teenager. And I had never heard of him, even though I've spent my whole career writing about gender and sexuality and issues like this. But I found out about him when I went back to graduate school in Oxford, when I was very middle-aged, when I was 48. And my advisor, Stefano Evangelista of Trinity College, gave me these gigantic tomes, these huge green books that were Symonds' letters. And he said, "You've got to read this." By the time I was just a few of Symonds' letters in, I was really hooked on this young man and his story. I was the mother of a teenage boy at that time. So the voice of a teenage boy kind of coming of age was very familiar to me, and really tugged at my heartstrings. But very early on in the letters, you see this teenager falling in love, with another young man whom he identified only as W. And you hear the transports and the beauty in a teenager's voice of that first experience of young love. And so romantic. I mean, all his life, Symonds was a great, great romantic. And I so identified with this as the mother of teenagers, and as a former teenager myself, who doesn't identify with that experience of first love. But very quickly, this young man realized that his great love had no future, and that there was nowhere he could go with it, because of the brutal laws against same-sex love and intimacy, same-sex intimacy in the 19th century in Britain. So you see him by the time he's 20, 21, he's an undergraduate at Balliol. He's writing this long, elaborate poem, a love poem to W. And they're meeting, and they, walk along the rivers, and they have these, deeply romantic encounters. And then by the time he's in his early 20s, he's writing an apology for this long Tennysonian love poem, in which he disavows anything that comes after, in which he basically says, none of this happened. Do not believe that there is any factual basis for this long love poem you're about to read. So he's disavowing this. And I go into the book why he's starting to realize by the time he's 21 that this love poem he's written could be evidence in a sodomy trial, with terrible repercussions. When he was already in high school, he saw that the headmaster was blackmailed for having same-sex relationships by his own father. And then by the time he was a fellow at Magdalen, he was hauled up in front of the fellows consortium because of another student had turned in letters of his that had homoerotic content. So, by the time he was a very young man, he had experienced over and over and over the fact that his sexuality, which he always experienced and wrote about as natural and organic and not the typical language of the day, not amoral, not vicious, not degraded, was bringing the full force of his culture against him. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he was having a nervous breakdown because he realized that he would never be able to pursue his career as what we would today call a gay man without blackmail, without horrible professional repercussions, without character assassination, and the exposure to criminal prosecution, which we can talk about some more. But sodomy was a capital offense in Britain until 1861. And this was very subject of a lot of both controversy and misinformation last spring, as many of you may know. But the truth is, which was widely misreported, dozens of men had been executed in the 19th century before 1835 for sodomy. And even, well into Simmons' lifetime, sodomy was a capital offense till 1861. Though men were not executed after 1835, they were given horrific sentences at hard labor for sodomy or transportation. So this is what this very young man realized he would be facing if he stayed in Britain. And if he tried to live as what we would call an out gay man or an openly gay man. That language didn't exist at that time. So he realized that he had to marry. And of course, this was something that a lot of men, most men we would today call gay, had to do, not unusual. He met a woman, and she's kind of extraordinary, Catherine North. And it seems as if he was as open with her as he could be, using the language that was available at that time. And it seems like she was really sad about it, but she loved him and she accepted him as he was. And one of the extraordinary things about Outrages and this story of Simmons is how, he was a beloved paterfamilias. His wife adored him. He had 4 daughters. They adored him. And all of them knew that he was basically leading a double life, which makes the conflict he experienced his whole life incredibly interesting. But even on his wedding night, he's keeping a journal, and he describes in painful detail what it's like to have sex with someone for whom you feel absolutely no physical attraction. And it's this kind of forensic, like heartbreaking description of what it's like to be on the inside of a homoerotically oriented being, and the loneliness of the marital bed, and probably her loneliness too. And he describes this, her loneliness and her sadness. He just was not attracted to women. And he turns kind of this very witnessing eye on his own knowledge of himself and the pain it was causing him and his wife, and leading to this double life that he led later. So I'm going to fast forward. Basically, one of the reasons he's so amazing as a person in everyone's history is that he refused to be silenced. Not only were there laws against sodomy, and his great mission in his life was to tell the truth that love between men was, as he saw it, ennobling and beautiful. But there were also laws against speech. In 1857, Britain passed the Obscene Publications Act, and I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, in telling the truth, this central truth of his life, he risked breaking the law on 2 different levels. And yet he wouldn't shut up. And as an activist and as a feminist and as, someone who just cares about social justice, I love this man so much because he would not be silenced no matter what they did. He finally had to give up Britain, his homeland, and give up a career in Britain because of the laws against sodomy, basically. And he moved to Davos, both for his health, he had tuberculosis, and also because the laws against same-sex connection were much less strict in Europe. They had Napoleonic law, which decriminalized consenting adult sex between men. And nonetheless, for 3 decades, he tried to tell the truth about love as he saw it, and it was illegal to do so. So he used so many stratagems, and this is where Outrages is kind of a literary detective story also. He used so many ways to evade the censors and evade prison, but tell the truth about the nobility with which he saw love between men and sex between men. He would, publish books of love poems, but change the pronouns right upon publication, having circulated the secret poems with the male pronoun for the beloved among his close friends. Or he would write about men whom today we would call gay in history, like Michelangelo Buonarroti, other figures in history, and that way tell the story of their loves, safely without risking prison. or he would, write a famous textbook, The Lives of the Greek Poets, in which he would embed descriptions, very subtly for the next generation of how the Greeks, classical antiquity, saw love between men as noble, as ennobling, as purifying to the soul. And it's amazing to me. One of the many amazing moments in researching Outrages was I was in the Morgan Library and I was reading, which is where many of these first editions and secret poems are housed. And I was reading a copy of Lives of the Greek Poets that was owned by a young Oscar Wilde. And there's like this scoring. They used to do it like this in the Victorian period. Instead of underlining, they would do two vertical lines on the side. And the sections in Lives of the Greek Poets where Symonds is talking about the beauty and nobility of love between men in classical antiquity, this very young Oscar Wilde is just scoring and scoring and scoring these passages. And then at one point you see this arc of wine drops across a page that has some of this content. And you can't help imagining a young Oscar Wilde, showing this page to friends or talking about it while he's got a glass of wine in his other hand. He was known to be a great gesticulator and storyteller and conversationalist, even at a very young age. And it was just thrilling to see this first kind of transmission that I've ever seen from an older, what we would call gay writer, to someone in the next generation, kind of embedding or encoding the secret text that it is beautiful for men to love men. It's not vicious, it's not degraded, and there were cultures in which men were not put to death or sentenced to 10 or 15 years at hard labor for loving men, and their cultures we admire, we in Victorian Britain, classical antiquity. So he tried for years to tell the truth, as I said, and one of the things he did was he kept a secret memoir, and he also would publish secret poems that he had printed himself, and he kept them, they were so illegal, he kept them in a locked metal box, and they were so illegal that his friends would beg him not to show them his latest secret sodomy poems, basically, because it was illegal to read them. It was illegal to circulate them. So there's this, other incredibly moving moment where Symonds is standing with his best friend on the bridge over the River Avon and throwing away the key to this locked box in which he keeps his secret self-published homoerotic poems. But to me as a writer, that is such a moving moment because Symonds did not throw away the box, he threw away the key. So these poems lived on. That so memorializes to me the locked box, the closet, as we would call it now, and throwing away the key but not the box. He willed those poems and that truth to survive him in spite of every prohibition. I want to take a step back and talk about why the background for Symonds' life is so important. And I'm going to say especially now, because so many themes in Outrages are so relevant to the current moment. I've been writing since The End of America, and I think of Outrages as kind of a prequel to The End of America. The End of America wrote in 2008 that if we didn't fight back, there would be tyranny in the United States of America. Here we are. And it's not that I was especially prescient. It's that I studied history and the histories of closing societies, and the signs were all there. It's there 10 steps to fascism. They always play out the same way. They're playing out now in the United States and around the world in what have been free societies. And it's not rocket science. So in Outrages, what you see is kind of the ancestor of these laws we now have, cracking down on speech, invading the body, managing, in which the state says, the state has the power to manage the commons. The state has the power to say who gets to sleep with whom, who gets to be what gender, what you can do with your uterus, right? Whether you can use contraception or not. Outrages really tells the story of origins. Where did this idea come from? That the state in a secular democracy, even a incomplete democracy like in Britain in the 19th century or in America in the 19th century, has the right to do that. I'm going to jump ahead. He finally, realized that he had to kind of stabilize his life into a double life. So he was a respectable father and community member in a heterosexual context in Davos with his 4 beloved daughters, but he would also go to Venice and spend time back and forth really with a younger group of men whom today we would call out gay men. And in this context, toward the end of his life, he met the love of his life at last. I wish that there was a soundtrack with like trumpets and harps and beautiful music, because he met Angelo Fusato. And if you would kindly show us the gondolier Angelo Fusato, if we sent that to you. There he is. He fell in love with him at first sight. And Fusato was married too. But these 2 men became immediately inseparable, and they were never separated for the rest of Simmons' lifetime. Fusato's wife also accepted this relationship. She may have had no choice. We don't hear from her really, but for the rest of his life, they entered into what today we would call a gay marriage, even though he wrote about this. He in one of his secret sodomy poems, Simmons imagined a world in which there would be gay marriage, same-sex marriage between men. But of course, he never saw this in his lifetime. But not only did Fusato never leave his side again, but when Simmons was finally dying young of tuberculosis, it was Fusato at his bedside tenderly caring for him, along with Simmons' own daughter, Madge, who, in some way accepted this relationship of her father's. And again, one of the last kind of amazing things Simmons left us is that he left us a kind of Rubik's Cube, not to give away the ending, but if you put together pieces of hints that he left us, something very beautiful springs into life, which I will leave you for your discovery in the book. Toward the end of his life, he wrote, I think emboldened by Whitman, a great manifesto. And again, he wrote it in secret because it was so illegal. And it was called A Problem in Modern Ethics. And this manifesto was directed at British jurists. Pardon me, it was directed at the people who were criminalized, who had criminalized same-sex intimacy and contact. And it's this masterful kind of polemic in which he dispatches with the myths about the degrading and corrupt and vile and amoral nature of male-male sex and love, and elevates it and cites how many countries in Europe had legalized it and nothing bad had happened. And he cites the classical antiquity as always, and he just skewers every myth that was current and leading to men being sentenced so cruelly for being close to each other. Problem in Modern Ethics, of course, couldn't be published in his lifetime. But again, he handed it to his friends secretly, and there were, it was passed from hand to hand secretly. Henry James knew about it. Edward Carpenter made notes on the margins. But he died, Simmons died young, and he never got to see the world that A Problem in Modern Ethics envisioned. However, and I will leave you with this, the power of words are so extraordinary because the message of Problem in Modern Ethics got absorbed into another book called Sexual Inversion by Havelock Ellis. This became a huge bestseller and, has been in printing after printing after printing, super famous. So Simmons' message did reach thousands and thousands of people, though not attributed to him, after his death. And not only that, Simmons left his secret memoir embargoed with all the secret codes in it. And that survived him and was published only a couple of years ago in a scholarly edition. So you can hold that in your hand. And so people who fought to decriminalize sex between men and fought to decriminalize speech, whether it was people fighting for Ginsburg's right to publish Howl in the United States or people fighting for the right of Lady Chatterley's Lover to be published, they were emboldened by what Simmons had done. And finally, sex between men was decriminalized in Britain and in America in the 60s. It doesn't mean same-sex relationships aren't always being targeted. They are. In fact, there are new efforts to assail the Human Rights Act in Britain, and terrible things, always, ready to take away these rights from people, from all of us. But Simmons' story, the world that we see around us, if we live in the West, in which, for the most part, people can speak freely for now, people can love freely for now, that is a world that Simmons envisioned and fought for his whole life, that Walt Whitman envisioned and fought for his whole life. They risked prison, they risked professional backlash, they risked silencing and repudiation, they suffered in their lifetimes, but the seeds that they planted descend to us in the freedoms that we enjoy. So that is Outrages, and that is why I'm so moved by this extraordinary man and his story, and the story of how our rights were initially stripped from us and what we need to do to protect them. And that is what I wanted to share with you today.